A Flea's Odyssey by J.P. O'Brien. Part 1. With her dozens of grandchildren bouncing around in a boisterous rabble, Baba Flechka lowered her gaze and raised a spindly arm aloft. Diminutive as she was, she still oozed an authority that made it clear when she had something to say, she would be saying it only once. Some of the more observant youngsters settled into a semicircle around her. Then, as the din gradually lowered, more followed, one by one. By some miracle, without so much as a single word from their aged grandmother, the whole group was soon sitting still, wide-eyed and ready to listen. Only then did Baba Flechka speak. "I'm going to tell you all a story that I was told when I was just a little girl," she began, easing herself down into her trusty rocking chair. One of the smallest of the children, Mishka, waddled over on unsteady young legs and held out his arms. Baba Flechka scooped him up and perched him on her lap. "It is the story of one of your long-distant relatives," she continued, wiping a crumb from little Mishka's cheek. "A hero, a pioneer, someone who achieved something quite exceptional in his lifetime. In fact, when my own babushka told me what I am about to tell you, I could not help but feel proud that a part of him lived on in me. But," she said, glancing at all the eager eyes looking back up at her, "it is only by telling and retelling his story that the flame of his legacy can continue to burn bright. Will you all promise to take these words forward with you?" The horde of enthusiastic young heads nodded in unison. One of the oldest of the grandchildren, Veronica, straightened her back proudly. "We promise, Baba." "Very good, my darlings. Let's see. Many people believe that the first animal in space was a mutt found on the streets of Moscow. Does anyone know her name?" "It was Laika," exclaimed Veronica, throwing an eager arm up in the air. Her large glasses slipped down her face. One of her cousins, Yegor, rolled his eyes and whispered something under his breath, prompting a ripple of giggles nearby. Baba Flechka shot a dagger-like glance in the older boy's direction. His cheeks instantly turned red. "That's exactly right," said the grandmother, turning back to Veronica with a wink. Veronica spun around to Yegor and stuck her tongue out. "Laika. And she was chosen to go on a very special trip. You see, humans, bless them, they have a tendency to test things out on other, as they see it, less important creatures. They wanted to know if any living thing could withstand the challenges of exploring the vast skies in a rocket." One of the younger boys, the chubby Georgie, leapt up from the floor with a whoosh sound, his arms outstretched as if he were the very rocket being shot into space. His unapologetic exuberance caused several of the other children around him to laugh. "But back then," continued Baba Flechka, as a somber expression clouded her face, "nothing like that had ever been attempted before. So Laika's journey was something of an experiment. Yes, it's true, she would be catapulted into both the stars and the history books. But, tragically, poor Laika would not survive her trailblazing trip." This revelation immediately took the wind out of Georgie's sails. His arms dropped to his sides. "Wait, she died?" "Yes, my love. I'm afraid so." A heavy silence overcame the group. Veronica hung her head as Georgie collapsed in a heap beside her. Even little Mishka's bottom lip started to tremble. "But, my little poopsiki," consoled Baba Flechka, giving Mishka an affectionate squeeze, "please don't be disheartened. While her loss was indeed a tragedy, it is not the full story. We have only just begun." Yes, it is true that Laika was one of the first animals in space, but she was not the only one. Another creature also happened to be there. A stowaway, you could call him, who, unlike Laika, did successfully navigate the perils of this voyage and return home. And that is who my story is about. Suddenly injected with energy, the crowd of children sat up to listen. This second creature was a flea, just like all of you, said Baba Flechka. Fyodor was his name. He would have been the great-grandfather of your great-grandfather's great-grandfather, and many more beside. More greats than I can even count. Hold on, Veronica erupted, as she pieced the story together for herself. Our grandfather knew Laika, the first animal in space. Not just knew, my sunshine, corrected Baba Flechka. They had a very special kinship. But you're rushing ahead. Let us start at the beginning. This Fyodor began his life, just as you all did, as a hopeful egg. An egg that had been laid just days earlier amongst the carpet fibers in the home of an ordinary human family. No sooner had the teeny-tiny Fyodor emerged from this egg, he found himself in an almost impossibly huge world. To him, even that humble living room had no end. Baba Flechka interrupted herself to laugh. Oh, my darlings, if only he knew back then what great things he would go on to see. When our newborn flea friend first tested his legs, he found that he was able to jump spectacularly high. We fleas can jump, of course, but Fyodor was something else. My own babushka joked that had he not found his way onto that rocket bound for space, his little legs would likely have propelled him up there anyway, sooner or later. Smiles of awe washed over the faces of the younger fleas. Georgie was once again bursting to spring out of his seat, but Veronica held him down so her grandmother could continue. But such a vulnerable little thing in the great big world would surely have withered away were it not for a remarkable stroke of good fortune. The biggest of the humans, you see, had returned home just that day with a dog for his children to play with. That dog, as you may have already guessed, was the lovely Laika. With such powerful jumping legs, it would hardly prove to be a problem for the tiny Fyodor to get up onto this dog's back, even though she was many hundreds of times his size. Just as well, for some reason, our hero found himself strongly and inescapably drawn to her. It was as if he could already smell his home. So, with an effortless spring, the tiny flea landed softly amongst Laika's wiry hair. As she spoke, little Mishka sprung out of her arms and landed on top of her own spongy perm. "Oh, you little shalonishka," she said, returning the baby to her lap. Georgie was desperate to emulate Fyodor's jump too, but was no match for Veronica's strong arms. Now, you may already know, Baba Flechka explained, that humans like to take very good care of their dogs. They keep them clean and fed and safe and happy. They will often give them a cozy bed in front of the fireplace and make sure their food and water bowls are always full to overflowing. As my dear mother, your prababushka, used to say to me, when the dog is happy, the flea on his back is happy. These are very wise words. Perhaps when each of you grows up and goes out to find your own way in the world, you may well be lucky enough to find yourself a family dog just like that. Baba Flechka stopped suddenly, then peered over the top of her spectacles. Just be cautious, my darlings. These humans, they sometimes like to hunt through the fur to try to find us. My dear Uncle Diadenka once had to get himself out of a very tight spot involving a tool of thin metal spikes. But that is another story. Several of the fleas exchanged horrified glances and gasps before turning back to their grandmother. Well, Baba Flechka went on. In those first moments, it appeared from Fyodor's viewpoint atop the lovely Laika's back that he had found himself in an exceptionally caring household. The beautiful children adored their new pet and held her close. Their happy laughter filled the air like music. Sure enough, in no time at all, this lucky flea had become quite content. He could nestle into Laika's hairs for warmth, or scurry around to play. There was plenty for him to eat. All he had to do was bite down to find the delicious nourishment on her skin. He would not have chosen to change a single thing. But he noticed that something wasn't right, my dears. The biggest member of the family, the human who had brought the dog home, didn't share his children's joy. There was a strange, thoughtful sadness in his eyes when he watched them play. You see, even from the very start, little Fyodor possessed most trustworthy instincts. It was only a few short days later when he realized that he and Laika were being taken away from that family's home in a dark and cramped cage. Neither Laika nor Fyodor would ever see those delightful children again. Baba Flechka paused with a lump in her throat. Fyodor had no way of knowing where he was or where he was being taken. This cage shook around violently. It was pitch black inside, uncomfortable, cold, and smelly. Poor Laika, too, must have been frantic, and Fyodor couldn't be sure if her shivers were from the cold or from her distress. As their long journey wore on, the pair drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. They were awoken by a chorus of humans yelling as the cage was being heaved from the back of a vehicle in the snow towards a remote building. When the bone-rattling movement finally stopped, they found themselves in a bright, tiled room. It was the complete opposite of the family's home. There were no soft carpet fibers or bowls of food or fireplaces here. Instead, machines with wires trailing to screens, sterile surfaces of metal, and desks piled high with countless stacks of paper. There were no loving children, just dozens of human adults wearing white coats. "Scientists!" interrupted Veronica. "Indeed, my petal. These scientists began taking endless notes on this little dog, her breathing and heart rate, all her reactions and movements. They shone lights in her eyes and inspected her mouth and wrote down everything they observed. One of them took a sharp razor and began shaving Laika's chest. The tiny Fyodor was thrown into a panic. "They're going to cut off all her hair," he thought. "They're looking for me." Absolutely petrified from fright, he watched the humans attach several sticky circles with coloured wires to the newly naked patches on Laika's skin. They were so close to him. All the little flea could do was shuffle from hiding place to hiding place and pray that the humans' poking and jabbing and scribbling would soon come to an end. "Now put yourself in Fyodor's shoes," said Baba Flechka as she stroked little Mishka's cheek. "None of this is normal for a dog. The humans give them lots of attention, yes, but they are not usually treated like a science experiment. It must have all seemed like torture." Then, in the corner of his eye, Fyodor noticed the first human again, the one who had brought Laika home to play with his children. He was standing in the shadows on the far side of the room, observing everything silently. "He'll stop this," shouted Yegor from the back of the group. "He wouldn't let them hurt his children's dog." "I admire your compassion, my darling," said Baba Flechka. But unfortunately the human did no such thing. He only watched for a moment longer before lowering his head and hurrying out through the door. The science experiment was to continue. Yegor could hardly conceal his disappointment. He averted his eyes so as not to let the other children see tears forming in them. A pair of the scientists, his grandmother continued, then strapped Laika down onto a thin bed inside a metal container, wedged between two great pads that looked like couch cushions. One of them began connecting the loose cables dangling from her chest to the panel above her head, leaning over the dog as he worked. Fyodor, watching from his hiding place amongst Laika's hair, realized he was now close enough to jump across this gap. He would land safely on the scientist's sleeve. This was his chance to abandon the poor Laika and make his escape. But he did not take it. Baba Flechka paused, closed her eyes, and leant back in her rocking chair. It creaked gently under her weight. For a long time afterwards, she said softly, Fyodor would think back to this moment and wonder if he had made the right choice. As you will see, it would be his last opportunity to avoid everything that was to follow. Why didn't he go? Perhaps in that instant he was too frightened to jump. Or maybe he was held in place by something even stronger than fear. Sometimes, my dears, the bravest thing a flea can do is stay. Baba Flechka bounced little Mishka on her lap and looked around. Her audience was, by now, so enraptured by her story they were as still as statues. One of the humans kissed Laika sweetly on her nose and whispered some words into her ear. Then they pulled a heavy lid down and sealed it over both the dog and his flea stowaway with a terrifying clank. At this point, chubby Georgie was kneeling so far forward he was almost toppling over. "They're trapped!" he burst out, unable to contain himself any longer. Veronica hushed him. "I'm afraid so, my darling," said Baba Flechka. In fact, the two of them were to remain inside this strange tin can for an unspeakably long time afterwards. In Laika's case, until the very end of her tragically short life. Of course, little Fyodor had no way to know yet what the future would bring. He could barely understand what was happening here and now. Remember, he was hardly more than an egg. Everything to him was still so huge and unknown. "Poor Fyodor," wailed Veronica, wrapping her arms around an unwilling Georgie to comfort herself. "He must have been so scared." "We can only imagine, my Solnishka." For a long time, little Fyodor was far too frightened to emerge from his hiding place amongst the rough hairs on Laika's back. But it appeared the humans had finished with their note-taking and left the two of them alone. Then again, at the very least, they were alone together. You see, in such a short time, Laika had become Fyodor's place of comfort and security. And though things indeed looked uncertain, he still somehow felt safe with her. In the unsettling silence that followed, the tiny flea gradually gathered the courage to emerge and try to make sense of where he was. He could now see that Laika's cramped bed was hemmed in on all sides by curved metal panels, held in place with rivets that dwarfed Fyodor in size. The air in their sealed compartment was icy cold, with an odor of grease, fuel, and machinery. Above the sleeping dog's head, there was a tiny window, no bigger than an apple, and Fyodor found he was able to spring up to a ledge on its rim to look out. But, only finding the deserted, tiled room on the other side, He quickly hopped back down to burrow into the folds of Laika's neck once more. Once, Fyodor heard muffled motion outside the container, and a pair of human eyes peeked through the window to gawk inside. Laika grew frantic at the sight of them. She howled and barked, as if pleading with them to let her out. But after quickly scribbling some notes, the human was gone again. It was during this time that Fyodor became desperate to make himself known to Laika, if only to let her know that she was not going through this ordeal alone. But, my darlings, she remained heartbreakingly oblivious to him. He was just too tiny, and might as well have not even been there at all. A single flea to a dog is nothing more than a speck. Then, just when he thought he could stand no more of the silence, Fyodor felt a great bump that knocked him sideways. Laika's ears stood up alert as she looked helplessly from side to side, but the leather straps and padded cushions held her body firmly in place. Fyodor instinctively burrowed deep into her hair again. Before long, there was a burst of activity all around. Their compartment felt like it was suddenly being shaken in the hands of a ferocious giant. The noise had grown to almost unbearable levels. Laika's stressed panting was drowned out by the deafening sounds of engines rumbling and computers screeching. From his hiding place, Fyodor could now make out a different kind of light shining through the shaking apple-sized window. Daylight. But in a matter of seconds, he saw it eaten by an intense fire. All of a sudden, it was not the intolerable cold that concerned Fyodor, but the intense heat. The humans had finished with their experiments, he thought, and now this poor dog and her tiny stowaway were simply being discarded on a bonfire. He was sure they were going to burn up into ash. As the temperature rose and the shaking became more and more extreme, Fyodor felt yet another extraordinary sensation, a pressure so tremendous it felt like the force of an entire world crushing down on him from above. Laika's body was pressed flat against the padded platform, and even with his powerful jumping legs, Fyodor would not have been able to peel himself off her back if he'd have leapt with all his might. What a poor little soul, squashed and deafened and burned alive, all at the same time. He was only at the very beginning of his life, and now he was certain it was already over. But fate, my angels, had other plans for our hero. You have been listening to the By Torchlight podcast. For more, visit patreon.com/bytorchlight or search By Torchlight on Spotify.